approaching their work.
Yeah, no, the great ways to go about it. And again, and as you're probably very familiar with the revision process, and because that's imperative. And trying to, I think this is a hard part some people face, is trying to remove yourself from it, because you're in your game, you're making it, you're in the trenches, in the weeds. So it's really easy to when you're that close to something, it's very easy to think oh, everything looks fine, right? But what I ask myself when I'm going through these exercises and things, and helping people with their messaging, I try to step back. It's always think about, what would someone say? What would someone think if they saw this for the first time? So when you're reviewing your own messaging and revising it, I would take that step back and be pretend you are just seeing that short description or just seeing that screenshot for the very first time. It doesn't make sense to you. And again, it can be a challenge sometimes and take some work to get to that point where you can really identify things. But if you're always asking yourself that question, you're going to look at it. You can look at it with a much clearer lens, outside of the in the weeds stuff that you're so used to, and then you can start really answering. Oh yeah, I do know what that means. And or you could be oh, I have no idea what I was talking about there. That's happened to me several times too. And like you said too, I think a great idea is looking at how other games and other studios describe and giving you an idea of that. Another thing I'd like to share, and this is actually something that I have used myself. It doesn't relate to gaming at all in terms of, it relates to everybody, to be honest. Anybody who's running a business, essentially. It's actually the process that I actually used when I updated my website to have more clear messaging. It's a book by Donald Miller called Building a Story Brand. It has you, I highly recommend it because it has you go through various exercises, specifically identifying pain points and things like that, all key important things. It's a little bit, it's kind of like identifying a player persona in a sense, but in a more concise, simple format. It's a bit of an exercise, but when you get through it, it can really help determine better messaging. Highly recommend that book. I'm not going to go into any more details about it other than I will put it in the show notes. That's a great process to really help you better identify, how to make clear messaging. Now, one thing I also want to talk about real quickly too, in terms of more specifically how to create concise messaging with short descriptions. And this could be applied long too. One is, I would just write whatever's top of mind after your revision process and everything, narrow it down, and just kind of go with there and asking others what they think and stuff. But when you're trying to come up with a very short description that gives everything that you need, this is what I do. In terms of things that I have identified and that are important to have are 4 characteristics, and those are a story element and or objective. It's kind of 3 things, but I'll explain how those can differentiate from each other. But a story element to your game, an objective element, mechanic, and then the genre. Those, I think, are the 4 main things that you want to really nail down for your description. And because having those elements really help clarify what the game is about. So I'll give another example here of who does this amazingly well. And you can probably guess what the game is and obviously the creator. But this is the description. Defy the god of the dead as you hack and slash out of the underworld in this roguelike dungeon crawler. Though that description alone consists of basically all those elements. And I didn't even read the full description because the last part of it is from the creators of Bastion, Transistor, and Pyre. So we know it's Supergiant. But to the point, they hit on all those elements so well for the game Hades. And that's what I've been able to identify that is great, because just from reading that alone, you have a clear sense of what the story is about, what your objective is, the mechanic, hack and slash essentially. So is this like a simple one to kind of do that, but also the roguelike with the genre. I mean, in Dungeon Crawl, like it just gives so much packed information in just one small sentence.
And I would even add to that to say, like, one thing that's really impressive about this description is that if you recall from earlier in the show, we had mentioned we want to make games that spark your imagination, like the games you played as a kid. And then this particular description for Hades is actually very genre focused. It's hack and slash, which is a genre in its own right, roguelike, dungeon crawler. Like when we had the conversation about accessibility of language earlier, it is very clear that Hades is not the type of game you expect, fans of Wii Sports to get into.
Exactly. Yep.
It is it's very obviously a game made for people who like video games, and the genre focus not only helps to further exemplify that, but it aligns perfectly with their mission statement because it calls back to genres of old that people played when they were younger, like Rogue,
Yeah. So, like, see how, and I'm glad you pointed that out because, again, what we mentioned before with consistency and everything, consistency doesn't necessarily just mean you're going to use the same messaging and maybe tweak it a little bit because of the character limitations and different platforms you could put it on and stuff. It's not so much about that. It's how does your messaging for you as a brand also align with that, and how does with your game description, and how does your game description messaging align with other things in other formats, like the example Mustapha provided earlier with wow, why can't I think of it? Not Fallout Guys, Among Us, and the messaging and the tone that they set for that. See, so that's what it means with consistency, and that's why I also share that whole book with you, building a story brand, because the characteristics in that book or the examples that they and guidelines that they provide you with in there helps you determine and really figure out how to align your messaging in all those different ways too. So again, thank you for pointing that out, Mustapha, because again, it really comes down to where else can you align and create consistency. And that's the thing, like, yes, this is work. If some of you are thinking about like, oh, that sounds like it's a lot of work. Well, it is. But like, when you start creating these foundations and things and these mindsets moving forward, it's just going to make you stronger. And that's why we're going into such detail and really emphasizing these points about that. So, but yeah, just to wrap that part up though, it's that is what I would suggest. Quick thing, if you're really looking to nail those short descriptions, those are way. Now, you don't have to have every fourth thing that I mentioned, because sometimes you might not necessarily show your mechanic that much. I will read off one more example that kind of is a little bit more mechanic focused, and that's from the game Wizard of Legend. And they simply say, so check them out on Steam if you need this, unless they've changed it recently. But Wizard of Legend is a no-nonsense, action-packed take on wizardry that emphasizes precise movements and smart comboing of spells in a roguelike dungeon crawler that features over 100 of unique spells and relics. All right. Just reading that out loud, that's kind of a mouthful, right? But it is very, very, very specific and targeted and kind of mechanic heavy. So again, to Mustapha's point with what Hades did in their description, I mean, this is a little bit more heavier, but they are very specific about the genre, the mechanics. So they're clearly giving that to people who want it. And those who don't are also going to clearly identify that they don't. And that's just as helpful as not. Because the worst thing you can have is giving wrong messaging, and then people buy your game, and then they go to Steam and are like, oh, yep, this is what I wanted. And you want nothing but positive reviews. And that's another way to kind of help, one of many, of course, to kind of help with that if you are narrowing down what your messaging is, clarifying it, so people who like it know that they'll like it, and people who wouldn't like it know as well. All right. Let's talk about lessons learned. Your favorite part, Mustafa.
Of course, of course.
So,
Oh, do you want me to lead in with the? Okay.
no, I was gonna ask you.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we provided some examples, but what are some other things that you can think of on if you don't clarify your messaging, what can happen?
I think the most kind of frightening consequence of not having clear messaging is that you could potentially just kind of fade into the background. You could just become part of the zeitgeist because there's no identity associated with your brand. And so I think that's ultimately the scariest thing. You could also confuse people. You could find yourself, like I mentioned earlier, working with collaborators who don't align with the vision of your brand. You can put yourself in all sorts of positions where you are unable to properly advocate for yourself because you don't have those citable, tangible messages indicating, the identity and values of your brand or your product.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, if there's just a couple of like short bullet points I'd add to that too, it's just like you could be providing kind of like what I alluded to just a moment ago. You can, give the wrong signals. If you're not really like, if you just say this is an RPG, well, RPG could also like mean a lot of different things. It can incorporate a lot of different things, different mechanics and things like that. Like, is it more tactical? Is it like action? Like, you know, that's an extreme example, but still, if you're giving the wrong examples and people who identify themselves as, and that's the thing too, sometimes people can identify themselves in this example as, I love RPGs, but what does that mean? Because I like RPGs, but a lot of them are probably going to be like more in the Final Fantasy realm of things. And yes, they have changed over the years and stuff, but still, like, that's how I define RPGs, is my interest with that IP, right? But someone else could be completely different, where it's more, let's say, RPG like Skyrim. Like, that can be, there's obviously some crossovers and whatnot, but that could be very different in what they're doing. So being more descriptive, you don't want to give those wrong.
Or Zelda, or
yeah, exactly. Like, any number of those things. And then just sometimes depending, like, let's say even if you're messaging with internally, like we talked about much earlier, or anywhere else, you may not get the answer you want, or you may not get the information you're looking for, or whatever that may be. So that's where, like, really clarifying and identifying those things and being concise. Because again, like, can't emphasize enough, but if you put too much detail into things, like, after a while, and I notice this a lot with like various people that I have worked with or communicated with, if you try to put too much information in one thing, they might just gravitate towards the one that's most important to them at that moment. And then you're still waiting on answers for the other stuff. But so, like, concise and simple and things like that are good. And then obviously too is just, if you like, again, kind of going back to similar points, is you can make it a challenge to properly serve your audience. And what that means is, if you know your audience and everything else and you want to serve them the right way, well, not clearly communicating what your messaging can then make it a challenge for them. And you don't want to do that, because then that's when, like you say, like kind of what Mustapha said, they can start dropping off. Because they don't have a clear grasp on what you are about, or what your game's about. All right, so as we close here, Mustapha, what are some, I don't know, any other tips or suggestions that you would suggest going forward? Just pick one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My final tip would be just to be conscious of words. They have very, very specific meanings, and they empower your message in a great and major way. So always pay attention to which ones you're using.
Yeah, and I'll add to that, because I still love the point you made earlier in when you were discussing about making that language accessible, because that was like right on with when you said that, and relates to what you just said. Good point. I'll I know I like to talk a lot, clearly. So I'll make it really simple with this one. Less is